The Interstellar Military Academy had been producing the galaxy's finest soldiers for approximately 4,000 standard years, which seemed impressive until one considered that most civilizations measured their histories in epochs rather than millennia. Still, 4,000 years was nothing to sneeze at, assuming one species possessed the biological capability to sneeze, which roughly 47% did not. The Academy's final trial had achieved legendary status across 17 star systems, whispered about in officers' clubs and training facilities from the core worlds to the outer reaches. It was called the Endurance, and it took place on Chirac 7, a planet that made most species' homeworld winters look like pleasant spring afternoons. Chirac 7 was a frozen nightmare, wrapped in ice storms and garnished with the kind of wind chill that could freeze exposed flesh in under 3 minutes. The Academy had chosen it specifically because it represented the worst possible environmental conditions short of actual death worlds, and even then, some argued it qualified. The trial was simple in concept, diabolical in execution. 30 days. 30 standard rotations on a planet where the temperature during what locals generously called summer hovered around -40 degrees. No rescue unless emergency beacons were activated, no supply drops. Just a cadet, minimal survival gear, and the kind of cold that made molecules reconsider their life choices. Here was the thing, though, the delicious irony that made senior instructors shake their heads every single year. Nobody finished it. Not completely. Not the full 30 days. The Velkari, with their triple-layered thermal biology, made it to day 18 before their heating units failed. The Thros, who evolved on a planet with ammonia oceans, tapped out at day 22 when their environmental suit developed microfractures. The record holder, a Krenix whose species could technically survive in hard vacuum for short periods, had managed 26 days before admitting defeat. 26 days was considered exceptional. 20 days earned honors. 15 days meant you passed. Anything less than 10 was grounds for recycling back through the program, assuming one survived the humiliation. The Academy had made peace with this reality. The instructors had revised their expectations decades ago, adjusted their grading criteria, and accepted that the endurance was less about completion and more about measuring one's threshold for misery. It built character, they said. It separated the merely competent from the genuinely dedicated. And then the human showed up. His name was Marc Chen, though he preferred Marc, and he had arrived at the Academy 6 months prior as part of humanity's first official cohort. Humans were the newest species to achieve faster-than-light capability, and the galaxy had greeted their arrival with the kind of polite enthusiasm typically reserved for distant relatives at family gatherings. "Sure, welcome. Glad you could make it. Please do not touch anything expensive." Marc stood roughly 1.8 meters tall, which made him average for his species and short for the Academy, where most cadets towered at 2 meters or above. He had dark hair that refused to conform to regulation standards, a tendency to smile at inappropriate moments, and an apparently chronic inability to take things seriously. His psychological evaluation had flagged him as possessing high stress tolerance and adaptive creativity, which were polite ways of saying he treated dangerous situations like interesting puzzles rather than existential threats. Commander Varath, the Velkari instructor overseeing this year's endurance trials, had reviewed Marc's file with growing concern. Humans were still something of an unknown quantity. Their homeworld featured an frankly disturbing variety of climate zones and hostile fauna. Their evolutionary path had apparently involved running after prey animals until said prey collapsed from exhaustion, which struck most species as horrifyingly inefficient. They had reached space age without first achieving global political unity, which was either impressive or insane depending on one's perspective. "You understand," Varath had said during the pre-trial briefing, his translator rendering his clicks and whistles into flat galactic standard, "that this is not mandatory for passing the academy. You can opt for the combat simulation alternative." Marc had grinned, which humans did when they found something amusing or were about to do something stupid. Often both. "Where's the fun in that, sir?" Fun. The human had used the word fun in reference to 30 days on a frozen hellscape. Varath had made a note in his datapad, possible death wish or cultural misunderstanding. Monitor closely. The other cadets attempting the endurance that year made for an interesting study in galactic diversity. Crixnol, a Thros female, had prepared for 6 months, bringing the finest environmental suit her significant family wealth could purchase. Tor Manix, a Kranix warrior caste, had undergone ritual fasting and meditation, treating the trial as a spiritual ordeal. Zephix, a Velkari like Varath himself, had requisitioned enough thermal gear to supply a small expedition. There were others, 11 in total, each equipped with technology that represented the cutting edge of survival science. Marc showed up with a standard-issue cold weather kit, a utility knife, a length of synthetic rope, and a bag that appeared to contain nothing but empty containers and fabric. "That is insufficient equipment," Varath had stated flatly. "Probably," Marc agreed, still smiling. "You will not survive." "We'll see." Varath had wanted to stop him. Should have stopped him, really. But Academy regulations were clear. If a cadet met the minimum gear requirements and passed the psychological screening, they could attempt the trial. Humanity had signed all the liability waivers. If this human wanted to freeze to death, proving some incomprehensible point, that was technically his prerogative. They dropped the cadets at staggered locations across Chirac 7's northern continent, each positioned roughly 100 kilometers from the extraction point. The distance was deliberate, forcing cadets to survive in place rather than simply hiking to the finish line. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant failure. Crixnol lasted 11 days before her suit's thermal regulator developed a fault. She activated her beacon, cursing impressively in 3 languages. Tor Manix made it to day 16, which was respectable, before admitting that spiritual fortitude could not entirely compensate for frostbite. Zephix, with all his expensive equipment, failed on day 19, when a storm destroyed his shelter. One by one, the cadets returned, cold and defeated but alive. Marc's beacon remained silent. Day 5 passed. Varath checked the tracking monitor obsessively, watching the small blip that represented the human's emergency beacon. It remained inactive. Inactive was good. Inactive meant he had not given up yet. It also meant he was still alive, presumably, unless he had died too quickly to activate it, which was a thought Varath tried not to entertain. Day 10. Still nothing. The betting pools had started on day 2, with most wagering he would quit by day 7. Those bets had been settled. New odds emerged. Day 12. Day 15. Nobody seriously believed he would break 20. "Should we check on him?" asked instructor Vexixari, a Kixari whose species experienced worry as a physical itch. "His beacon is intact and transmitting status pings," Varath replied. "Protocol says we wait." Protocol was written assuming rational behavior. Your point being. Day 15 arrived. Then day 20. The human was still out there. Varath found himself staring at the monitor during off hours, trying to understand it. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The storms had intensified. 2 separate weather systems had converged over the northern continent, creating conditions that made the previous weeks look pleasant. Nothing should be surviving out there. Nothing without a heated bunker or advanced thermal technology. Humans, Vorath recalled from the xenobiology briefings, maintained their body temperature internally through metabolic processes. They were warm-blooded, like the Velkari, but their tolerance ranges seemed narrower. They came from a moderate world, mostly temperate zones with seasonal variations. Nothing in their evolution suggested they should be adapted for extreme cold. And yet the beacon remained silent. Day 25. Day 26. Breaking the previous record. Day 27. The entire instructor staff gathered around the monitor now, watching like it was some kind of sporting event. Cadets, who had already failed, whispered in the corridors, speculating wildly. Maybe he had found a geothermal vent. Maybe he had gone insane, and the beacon was simply transmitting from his frozen corpse. Maybe humans possessed some hidden physiological adaptation their initial scans had missed. Day 28. Day 29. On day 30, precisely at the moment the timer expired, Marc activated his beacon. The extraction shuttle found him 3 hours later. Vorath insisted on personally leading the recovery team, partly from duty and partly from sheer morbid curiosity. They spotted him from 2 kilometers out, a figure moving across the ice field toward the designated extraction point. As they drew closer, Vorath felt his secondary eyelids flutter in confusion, which was a Velkari physiological response to encountering something that made absolutely no sense. The human was wearing furs, not his issued cold-weather gear, but actual animal furs, stitched together into a crude but apparently effective garment that covered him from shoulders to knees. More furs wrapped his hands and feet. His face was partially obscured by a hood made from what looked like the pelt of something with very thick, very white fur. He was also dragging something. 2 somethings, actually. Large carcasses, stripped and partially butchered, tied to a makeshift sled, constructed from branches and his issued equipment. Marc looked up as the shuttle approached, raised one fur-wrapped hand in greeting, and called out something that the translator rendered as, "Hey, perfect timing. Help me load these." The debriefing took 3 hours, partly because Vorath kept asking Marc to repeat himself, certain something was being lost in translation. "You hunted the wildlife," Vorath said slowly, "for the 4th time." "Well, yeah, I got hungry around day 3. The indigenous fauna of Kirax 7 are extremely dangerous. The briefing materials specifically warned against engaging them. The big white ones with the teeth." Marc asked cheerfully. "Yeah, those were tricky, but they hunt in predictable patterns. If you watch them for a few days, you can figure out their routes. I dug a pit trap, lined it with sharpened stakes, covered it with snow. Basic stuff. Basic stuff." The human had described killing an apex predator as basic stuff. "And the furs?" Vexixari asked weakly. "Well, I couldn't just waste the carcass. The pelt was incredibly thick, way better insulation than my issued gear. I used the knife to scrape it, stretched it out to dry, stitched pieces together with sinew. Took me about 4 days to make the first coat. After that, I just kept improving the design." "You made clothing," Vorath said. "Sure. You guys do know humans have been doing that for like 50,000 years, right? It's not complicated. Kill animal, skin animal, wear animal. Our ancestors figured it out with stone tools. I had a metal knife. Made it way easier." There was a long silence in the debriefing room. "What about shelter?" someone asked. "Dug a snow cave the first day. Learned that as a kid during winter camping trips. Snow's actually a pretty good insulator if you know what you're doing. Later I found an ice formation that made a better windbreak, expanded it into a proper shelter. Used branches from those scraggly trees in the valley for structural support. Started a fire once I got the cave sealed up properly. Fire. Vorath's voice had climbed an octave. Fire how? Friction method at first, which sucked and took forever. But once I killed the first animal, I could render fat for fuel. Made a primitive lamp, kept it burning. Heat source, light, and I could cook meat. Killed several more animals once I figured out the hunting patterns. Smoked some of the meat for preservation. He gestured at the carcasses outside. Figured I'd bring some back. Seems wasteful to leave it. Vorath looked at his fellow instructors. They looked back at him. Everyone seemed to be sharing the same thought, which was that perhaps they had fundamentally misunderstood something about humanity. Let me make sure I understand, Vorath said carefully. Instead of enduring the environment with your issued equipment, you simply adapted to it using primitive survival techniques. I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds weird, Marc replied. But yeah, basically, the gear you gave us was fine for maybe a week if you're careful, but 30 days. That's a long time. You need sustainable solutions. Shelter, water, food, warmth. Those are the basics. Once you have those, it's just about maintaining them and staying alert. And you learned these skills where? Oh, various places. My dad used to take me camping in northern Canada, summer youth program in Alaska, did a semester abroad in Norway during university, plus, you know, human history. We've been living in cold environments since we migrated out of Africa, like 100,000 years ago. The Inuit, the Sami, the Mongols, they all figured out how to thrive in places that made Kirex 7 look reasonable. I just used the same principles. Vorath made several notes on his datapad, though he suspected that no amount of note-taking would adequately capture the absurdity of this situation. The most advanced military academy in known space, representing thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and technology, had been creating a trial that tested endurance through suffering. The human had approached it as a camping trip, and simply lived there. The other cadets used technology. Vex Ixari pointed out. Advanced environmental suits, thermal generators, climate-controlled habitats. Right, and when that technology failed or ran out of power, they had to quit, Marc said, nodding. Makes sense. Tech is great until it breaks. But a fur coat doesn't run out of batteries. A snow shelter doesn't have mechanical failures. Cooked meat stays preserved in freezing temperatures without refrigeration. Low-tech solutions are sometimes more reliable than high-tech ones. The thought hung in the air like an accusation. 4,000 years of academy tradition, and apparently they had been overcomplicating things. So you were never in actual danger? Vorath asked. Marc laughed, which was apparently what humans did when something struck them as particularly absurd. Oh no, I was in danger constantly. Those predators I mentioned almost got me twice before I figured out their hunting behavior. The cold nearly killed me the first night before I got the shelter right. I had some close calls with frostbite around day 8, and that storm on day 23 was genuinely terrifying. Thought my shelter would collapse. But danger is just part of it, you know. You manage the risks, stay alert, adapt when things change. That's survival. Vorath was beginning to understand why humanity had achieved spaceflight, despite their chaotic political situation. A species that viewed mortal danger as something to manage rather than avoid had a certain evolutionary advantage, even if that advantage occasionally resembled insanity. Well, he said finally, you have completed the trial. Full 30 days. First cadet in Academy history to do so. Congratulations. Thanks. So, about the meat. Can I keep it? Seems like a waste to just leave it, and honestly, it tastes pretty good. I was thinking I could share it with the other cadets. Maybe do a barbecue thing in the common area. We could make it a cultural exchange event. A barbecue. The human wanted to host a barbecue featuring meat from an alien Deathworld predator. I will submit the request to administration, Vorath said weakly. News of Marc's achievement spread through the academy with the speed of scandalized gossip, which was notably faster than official communications. Within 2 days, every cadet knew the story. Within 4 days, it had reached the instructors at other training facilities. Within a week, military commanders across multiple star systems were having very uncomfortable conversations about the assumptions underlying their survival training programs. The Academy administration faced a delicate problem. On one hand, Marc had legitimately completed a challenge that had stood uncompleted for 4 millennia. On the other hand, he had done so by effectively ignoring the intended methodology and reverting to what most species considered primitive survival techniques. Did that count? Should that count? Was it really completing the challenge if one simply lived there like an ancient hunter-gatherer instead of heroically enduring it with military technology? After 3 weeks of debate, they decided that yes, it counted, primarily because there was no rule explicitly forbidding hunting, skinning, and wearing the local wildlife. The regulations had never anticipated anyone would try. They gave Marc top honors in his class. They also quietly revised the endurance trial parameters for the following year, adding specific prohibitions on hunting indigenous fauna, manufacturing clothing from biological materials, and establishing long-term habitation shelters. Future cadets would have to suffer properly, with technology, the way the trial intended. Marc accepted his honors with the same easy grin he wore constantly, seemed genuinely puzzled by all the attention, and proceeded to host his barbecue in the cadet common area. Approximately 200 cadets from 17 different species showed up, partly from curiosity and partly from the kind of morbid fascination that made people watch horror films. The meat, improbably, was delicious, though several species required enzyme supplements to digest it properly. Commander Vorath attended the event, standing in the corner and watching cadets from across the galaxy bonding over grilled meat and this human's inexplicable survival story. He had spent 40 years training military personnel. He had mastered strategy, logistics, and command theory. He understood military doctrine from a dozen civilizations. But watching Marc explain to a group of fascinated Velkari cadets how to properly skin and cure animal hides, Vorath realized something uncomfortable. The galaxy had spent millennia developing increasingly sophisticated technology to overcome environmental challenges. They had climate control, artificial gravity, force fields, and environmental suits that could sustain life in hard vacuum. They had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that sentient beings had survived and thrived for eons before any of that technology existed. Humans remembered. Or rather, they had never needed to forget. Their leap from stone tools to starships had been remarkably quick by galactic standards, quick enough that the old skills remained in living memory, passed down through something they called camping and outdoor education. They could operate a fusion reactor and start a fire with sticks, pilot a starship and navigate by stars, use advanced medical technology and set broken bones with splints. They were simultaneously primitive and advanced, carrying their entire evolutionary history with them into space. It was, Vorath reflected, either going to make them incredibly valuable allies or absolutely terrifying opponents. Possibly both. Marc noticed him watching and walked over, holding a plate of grilled meat and something else Vorath did not recognize. "Commander, want to try some? I marinated this batch in some herbs I found growing in the valley. Totally safe. I had medical scan them first. You foraged herbs. During the survival trial, sure, once I had the survival basics covered. No point eating bland food for 30 days if you don't have to. The human had advanced beyond mere survival to considering cuisine. Naturally, Vorath accepted the offered food, tried a small piece, and discovered that it was indeed excellent. The human was a competent cook on top of everything else. Why not? The galaxy was clearly operating on bizarre principles now. You know, Marc said conversationally, a few of the other cadets asked me to teach a class on primitive survival techniques. I was thinking it could be interesting, like a practical elective, back to basics kind of thing. What do you think? Vorath considered the question. He thought about 4,000 years of tradition, about his own assumptions and biases, about the uncomfortable truth that military excellence sometimes meant remembering old solutions rather than only seeking new ones. He thought about the fact that one human with a knife and basic knowledge had succeeded where cadets with advanced technology had failed. I think, he said slowly, that would be acceptable, pending administrative approval. Awesome. Marc grinned again, that perpetual expression of inappropriate enthusiasm. This is going to be fun. There was that word again. Fun. Vorath excused himself, found a quiet corner, and updated Marc's file one final time. Under psychological evaluation, he deleted the previous notes about possible death wishes and cultural misunderstandings. He replaced them with a single line: species demonstrates unusual resilience through primitive adaptability. Recommend monitoring human training methodologies for potential integration. Then, because he was thorough and because the galaxy operated on documentation, he added a personal note that would never make it into official reports. The humans are going to change everything, and we are not remotely prepared. But he kept that thought to himself, finished his portion of the surprisingly excellent meat, and went to approve the paperwork for humanity's first primitive survival elective at the most advanced military academy in known space. Somewhere, 4,000 years of tradition sighed in resignation and made room for the new guy who had shown up wearing furs and carrying dinner.